At 19, she was married off, still innocent, to a poor farmer. What he did on their wedding shocked. The wind carried a bitter chill that morning as snow dusted the earth in a pale silence. The girl stood by the doorway, her fingers trembling against the coarse fabric of her dress. 19 years old, her heart still tender and uncertain, she had been married off that very dawn, her father's calloused hand sealing her fate with the handshake of a man she barely knew. The man before her, tall, broad-shouldered, and solemn-eyed, was a poor farmer from the outskirts of town. His clothes smelled faintly of the fields and smoke, and though his manner was steady, there was something in his gaze that made her chest tighten, not fear, but a kind of unspoken gravity. She didn't cry, though her mother did. The small house where she had been raised faded behind her as the horse-drawn wagon creaked down the frozen path. Her husband, silent beside her, kept his eyes on the endless white horizon. She wanted to ask him something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat. The air between them was both fragile and heavy. When they arrived, she saw the place that would now be her home, a wooden cabin crouched at the edge of a snow-covered field. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. It looked lonely, half swallowed by the vast plains, and she wondered how many winters it had endured. He stepped down first, offering his hand. She hesitated, then placed her small gloved fingers into his. His touch was warm, surprisingly gentle. "It's not much," he said, his voice low and rough, "but it's home." Inside, the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint trace of pine. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, and she could feel the cold beginning to seep from her bones. He brought in a small stack of logs, placing them near the fire. "We'll need more before night," he murmured. She nodded, unsure if he expected her to answer. Later, they stood outside together. The snow crunched beneath their boots. He split the wood with deliberate strength, each swing of his axe sending a sharp crack through the quiet air. She knelt to gather the pieces, her red gloves brushing the splinters. For the first time that day, a faint smile touched her lips. He noticed, and something softened in his expression. The silence between them became less of a wall and more of a bridge. They worked like that for a while, the farmer chopping, the young bride gathering, their breaths mingling in white clouds. The rhythm of it was oddly comforting, a language without words. When he finally paused, he glanced at her and said, "You're not afraid of work?" She shook her head, a small blush rising on her cheeks. "My mother says a woman's hands should always be busy." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Your mother's a wise woman." That night, they ate by the fire, bread, beans, and a bit of stew he had made himself. She was surprised by the tenderness with which he served her, the care he took to make sure her bowl was full. When their eyes met over the flickering light, she looked away quickly. He didn't touch her, didn't claim her as everyone had warned she should expect. Instead, after dinner, he took a blanket and laid it near the fire. "You take the bed," he said quietly. "It's warmer. I'll sleep here." She stared at him, confused. "But, we're married." He smiled faintly, though there was sadness in his eyes. "We are, but you don't know me. Not yet. You'll sleep easier this way." And that was what shocked her. Not cruelty, not possession, but kindness. A kind she had never imagined could come from a man she barely knew. Days turned into weeks. She learned the rhythm of his life. The mornings before dawn, the sound of the axe, the scent of earth and sweat. He worked hard, his hands rough and scarred, yet his touch was always careful around her. He showed her how to milk the cow, how to mend the fence, how to stack the wood so it stayed dry. In return, she brought warmth to the house, her laughter, her cooking, the soft hum of her voice as she swept or washed. They began to share small smiles, brief glances that lingered a little too long. Once, as they carried a heavy bucket together, their hands brushed. Neither spoke, but the air between them felt charged, alive. One evening, as snow drifted against the windows, he came in later than usual. She had left a bowl of stew for him, still warm by the fire. "You waited up?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "The wind." He smiled. A real smile this time, one that reached his tired eyes. "The wind's nothing to fear," he said. "It just reminds us we're not alone." She looked at him then, realizing he was lonelier than she had guessed. A man who had built his life on silence and solitude. And for the first time, she saw past the roughness to the heart beneath. Kind, weary, good. Spring came slowly, melting the snow and softening the earth. She planted seeds behind the cabin, kneeling in the damp soil as he worked the plow nearby. Sometimes he would pause, watching her with quiet pride. The farm began to look alive again, not just because of the crops, but because laughter had returned to it. Months passed, and the distance between them shrank. They began to talk more. About her childhood, about his years alone after his parents died, about the dreams neither of them had dared to voice. One night, when the first summer storm rolled across the plains, he found her standing by the window, watching the lightning paint the sky. He stepped close behind her, his breath warm against her neck. She turned slowly, and this time, when his hand found hers, she didn't pull away. The kiss that followed was soft, uncertain, the meeting of two souls who had learned each other's silences long before they shared a word of love. The years that followed were not easy. The farm demanded everything: sweat, sacrifice, endless labor. But they faced it together. When the crops failed one winter, she stood beside him, her hands raw from work but her spirit unbroken. When she bore their first child, he held her hand through every scream, his eyes wet with tears he didn't hide. He built her a cradle by hand, carving it smooth by the firelight. "For our future," he said, voice thick with emotion. Time softened them both. She grew into the rhythm of the land, her youth tempered by strength. He grew gentler, his edges worn down by love. They laughed often now, not the shy laughter of strangers, but the easy joy of those who had built something unshakable. Years later, as snow once again blanketed the world outside, they found themselves by the same window where their first kiss had happened. The children slept nearby, their soft breaths filling the small house. She looked up at him, her husband, her partner, the man she had once feared but had grown to love beyond words. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing a strand of hair away. "Do you ever wish your life had been different?" he asked softly. She smiled through the quiet glow of the fire. "If it had been different, I might never have met you." He drew her close then, his forehead resting against hers, the world beyond them lost in the hush of falling snow. In that moment, she realized, what had once begun as duty had become something sacred. Not the marriage her father arranged, but the life they had built, plank by plank, day by day, heart by heart. And as the storm whispered outside, they stood together, no longer strangers, no longer bound by circumstance, but bound instead by love that had weathered every winter and bloomed through every thaw. The winter night stretched deep and silent, the cabin breathing with the soft rhythm of warmth and love. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen plains, brushing against the walls like a restless spirit, but inside there was peace, the kind of peace that only years of shared labor, laughter, and quiet forgiveness could build. The fire crackled gently, throwing its amber glow across their faces. She lay with her head against his shoulder, listening to the strong beat of his heart. That sound had once seemed foreign to her, distant as thunder rolling over the horizon. Now it was home, steady, certain, hers. He brushed his thumb over her hair, his voice rough with weariness and affection. "Tomorrow, I'll fix the south fence before the thaw," he murmured. "Cattle'll be restless come spring." She smiled softly against his shirt. "You've been saying that for a week." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "A man can dream of rest, can't he?" Her laughter was quiet but bright, like the flicker of a lantern in the dark. It still amazed him sometimes, how that sound, so light, so full of life, could cut through all the years of loneliness he had endured before her. There had been a time when the only voices in that cabin were the wind and the echo of his own thoughts. Now there were children's footsteps, her song in the mornings, her gentle hum as she kneaded bread. But beneath all that peace, something heavier stirred, the kind of worry that settles in a man's bones when he's lived long enough to know how fragile happiness can be. The next morning, the world was a cold glass stillness. Frost lay thick on the window pane, and the breath of the cattle rose in clouds as he went out to the yard. The sun was only beginning to rise, pale and shy behind the horizon. She watched him through the window, his silhouette moving against the snow, strong and patient as ever. Their children still slept in the loft, bundled under thick quilts she had sewn by hand. She poured water into the kettle, listening to the hiss as it met the iron. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, and for a moment, life felt beautifully ordinary, a string of small miracles tied together by love. By midday, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The air tasted of snow. He came in from the field, his hat dusted white, his beard rimmed with frost. She met him at the door, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've been out since dawn." He kissed her forehead, the brief press of lips rough but tender. "Rest'll come after the work's done. But work, on a farm, is never done." Over the next few weeks, the thaw came early, turning the fields into rivers of mud. The fences sagged under the weight of melting snow. He worked harder, longer, his hands raw and his back bent. She scolded him for pushing too much, yet every night she still waited up, setting aside a plate for him, her lamp burning in the window. Sometimes, as he came in through the door, exhausted and silent, she would see the boy he had once been hidden behind his eyes. The boy who had lost his parents to fever, who had built everything from nothing, who had never learned to rest. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, she found him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening fields. The wind tugged at his hair, and the scent of rain hung thick in the air. She stepped beside him, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders before sitting close. "Something's troubling you," she said quietly. He didn't answer at first. Then, with a sigh, he said, "The crops look thin this year. If the rains don't hold, we might lose half the yield." She placed her hand on his. "We'll manage. We always do." He looked at her then. Really looked. Her face was calmer than his, but he could see the fatigue there too, the quiet burden of a woman who had given everything for this life. "You shouldn't have to carry so much," he said softly. Her lips curved into a small, sad smile. "Neither should you. But love makes the load lighter." The rain began to fall then, soft at first, then harder, washing over the land. They sat together as the storm broke, the thunder echoing like old memories, their fingers intertwined. Months passed. The rain fed the fields, the grass turned green again, and the air filled with the hum of summer. Their children grew strong and wild, racing barefoot through the fields, chasing fireflies at dusk. The house, once silent and cold, now rang with laughter. Still, life on the frontier was not gentle. One morning, their youngest took sick. It came on sudden, fever and shivers that no fire could chase away. She sat by the bed, wiping her child's brow with trembling hands, whispering prayers under her breath. He rode to town through the night for the doctor, his heart pounding like hooves in his chest. By the time he returned, the fever had broken, but his wife sat slumped by the bedside, her face pale from worry. He knelt beside her, pressing his forehead against hers. "You saved her," he whispered. "You did." Tears glistened in her eyes. "No," she said, shaking her head. "We both did." In that fragile dawn, as the child slept peacefully between them, they held each other and understood something unspoken. That love was not just the fire of passion, but the endurance of two hearts weathering every storm together. The years slipped by quietly, marked not by grand moments but by the steady rhythm of living. The harvests came and went. Their children grew, their laughter turning into the voices of youth. The oldest boy began to help his father in the fields, his hands growing strong around the same plow that had once seemed too heavy for a man alone. There were evenings when the family gathered by the fire, the air filled with the scent of stew and wood smoke, the children telling stories while their parents exchanged tired but contented smiles. The simple life had become something sacred, not grand, but full. Then one winter, the snow came earlier than ever before. It blanketed the land in silence, deeper and colder than they had known in years. Supplies ran low, and the roads to town were buried. For days, they burned through their woodpile faster than they could replenish it. He would not let her go out in the cold, so he worked late into the night, chopping logs while the wind tore at his coat. She watched from the window, fear tightening her chest. His breath came in white clouds, his movements slower each day. When he returned inside, his face was pale, his fingers stiff and red from frost. She took his hands between hers, warming them with her breath, whispering, "Please, rest. The cold will take you if you keep on like this." He smiled faintly, brushing her cheek. "I've fought colder nights," he said, "and I always come back to you." But that night, as he lay beside her, a deep cough took hold. It started as a whisper, then grew into something harsher. She rose and lit the lamp, her heart trembling. He tried to wave it off, but she saw the pain behind his eyes. The days that followed were heavy with worry. The fever burned through him just as it had once burned through their child. She sat by his bedside now, feeding him spoonfuls of broth, whispering prayers into the quiet. The snow outside kept falling, and the sound of the wind seemed to mourn with her. One evening, he reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "You remember the night I said I'd sleep by the fire, when we first married?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I didn't do it out of pity," he said softly. "I did it because I wanted you to know you were safe. I wanted you to choose to love me, not be forced to." Her tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "I did choose you," she whispered. "Every day since." He smiled then, the faintest trace of peace softening his features. "Then I've had a good life." He slept after that, the fever easing slowly, as if the warmth of her love anchored him back from the edge. Days later, when the first signs of spring appeared, small cracks of sunlight breaking through the frost, his strength began to return. It was a slow recovery, but she never left his side, and when he finally rose from bed, she caught his arm, steadying him. "See," she said with a watery smile, "even the earth knows how to heal." By the time summer came again, they had found new rhythm. He moved more slowly now, his body marked by years of toil, but his eyes still held the same quiet fire. Their children had begun to grow into their own lives, the oldest helping with the farm, the youngest daughter learning to sew beside her mother. Sometimes, in the soft evenings when the sun sank low and gold over the horizon, he would sit beside his wife on the porch, their hands entwined as they watched their children chase each other through the fields. The laughter carried across the land like music. He turned to her once, his voice low. "When I was young, I thought love was a thing that struck like lightning, sudden and fierce. But it isn't. It's the quiet work of years. The way you keep showing up, even when the fire burns low." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "That's because lightning fades. But the fire, the one we build, it stays." Autumn brought with it a calm beauty. The harvest was good that year, the barns full, the family strong. They hosted neighbors for supper, laughter filling the air as stories were shared and music played. She watched her husband from across the room, the lamplight warm on his face, and felt that same soft awe she had felt as a young bride watching him split wood in the snow. The strength, the gentleness, the unspoken care. But time, like the seasons, moves with quiet inevitability. Years later, the children were grown. The house was quieter, though not empty. The farm still stood strong, weathered but proud. Still stood strong, weathered but proud. He had aged, his hair now silver, his steps slower, but his eyes still carried the same depth that had once startled her at 19. One evening, as snow began to fall again, he took her hands in his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "You remember our first winter?" he asked, smiling faintly. She laughed softly. "How could I forget? You let me have the bed while you slept by the fire like some stubborn fool." "I'd do it again," he said. 1,000 times over. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the snow drift past the window. The world outside was the same white silence it had been all those years ago, but now it felt softer, less lonely. Later that night, as the fire burned low, he fell asleep in his chair beside her. His hand slipped from hers, his breathing steady and slow. She watched him, her heart full of gratitude, of love, of a life that had been built not from riches or ease, but from endurance and gentleness. When dawn came, the first light touched his face, and for a moment, he looked as young as he once had, the lines of hardship softened by peace. She reached out and brushed his hair from his brow, whispering, "Rest, my love. You've given enough." He stirred faintly, his lips curving into a small smile, and though his eyes did not open, she felt his warmth, his presence, his love lingering like the soft glow of the morning. Outside, the land stretched vast and endless, the snow gleaming under the rising sun. The house stood firm, smoke curling from the chimney, a testament to the life they had built, to the love that had endured every season. And as the wind whispered across the plains, it carried the memory of a girl once 19 and afraid, and the man who had taught her that love was not a chain, but a choice, one made every day, in every small act of kindness, until it became the very rhythm of their hearts. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over the plains, brushing the frost from the roofs and fences, wrapping the land in a faint gold. The cabin stood still against the quiet expanse, its chimney breathing a soft curl of smoke into the calm air. Inside, she sat by the hearth, her fingers tracing idle circles on the wooden armrest of the chair beside her, his chair. The cushion still held the faint shape of his body, the scent of smoke and pine clinging to it like memory itself. He had grown weaker since that long winter, his steps slower, his breath shorter, but he still rose every morning with the same quiet resolve. Even as the years pressed harder against his frame, he refused to yield to rest. He said it was the land that kept him alive, the sound of the wind across the fields, the call of the cattle, the rhythm of the axe and plow. But she knew it was more than that. It was love. It was her. On that morning, as she stirred the porridge and poured his cup of coffee, she noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. His once strong fingers, those that had built the house, plowed the soil, and held her through every storm, now seemed fragile, like old roots gripping the earth. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You should rest today," she said softly. He smiled faintly, that same half-smile that had once softened her heart when she was a young bride. "If I rest, the work won't get done." "The work will wait," she whispered. "It always does." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with the warmth of years gone by. "And what would I do if I rested? Sit here and watch time slip away?" "No, love, I'll take it slow, but I'll keep moving. That's how I know I'm still living." She didn't argue. She had long learned that some parts of him could not be changed. The stubbornness, the will, the need to keep giving even when the world asked nothing more of him. Instead, she stood and wrapped his scarf around his neck, her fingers brushing against his stubbled cheek. "Then promise me you'll be careful." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Always." Outside, the day was calm and clear. He went to mend the fence along the east pasture, while she busied herself with the small tasks of the home, kneading dough, patching clothes, humming the old song he loved. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth and smoke. Every so often, she glanced out the window, watching him move steadily through the field, his hat low against the sun. By afternoon, she brought him a cup of warm broth. He sat on the fence rail, resting, his breath visible in the cool air. She handed him the tin cup and leaned beside him. For a long moment, they said nothing, just watched the horizon stretch endless and blue. "You ever think about the first day you came here?" he asked. She smiled, her eyes softening. "I thought I'd never be happy." And now, she looked at him, at the lines carved deep into his face by years of love and labor. "Now I can't imagine life anywhere else." He nodded, his eyes glinting in the sunlight. "That's all I ever wanted for you." That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, they walked back together, their hands brushing in the dim light. The world felt quieter than usual, the stillness heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He coughed as they reached the door, just once, but it lingered. She frowned, but he waved it off. "Just the cold settling in," he said with a weary smile. Later that night, the wind picked up, moaning low around the cabin walls. She woke to the sound of him coughing again, this time deeper, harsher. She rose quickly, lighting the lamp and kneeling beside him. His skin was pale, his breath uneven. "I'm fine," he rasped, trying to sit up, but she pressed a hand to his chest. "No, you're not. Lie still." He obeyed, though the stubborn light still flickered in his eyes. She wiped his brow with a damp cloth, the room filled with the faint crackle of the fire. His fingers found hers, squeezing weakly. "Don't you worry," he murmured. "It's just the years catching up." But she did worry, deeply. For 3 days, he lay in bed while the snow fell heavy outside, blanketing the fields in white silence. She tended to him without rest, feeding him broth, stoking the fire, singing softly when the fever rose. Sometimes he slept, sometimes he watched her with that quiet look that seemed to hold a lifetime inside it. On the 4th night, as the storm eased, he called her name softly. She came to his side, taking his hand. "I need to tell you something," he whispered. "Don't speak," she said. "Save your strength." He shook his head slightly. "No, I need you to hear me. When I was younger, Before I met you, I thought my life would be nothing but work and loneliness. I had accepted it. I thought love was a luxury for men richer than me. But then you came, and everything changed. Tears filled her eyes. You gave me a life, she whispered. He smiled faintly. No, love, you gave it to me. You made this place a home. You gave me warmth, laughter, children, everything worth living for. If I could live it all again, I wouldn't change a thing. Her tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she held his. Don't talk like that, she pleaded. You're not leaving me. He reached up, brushing away a tear with his thumb. We don't get to choose when, my love. But I want you to promise me something. When the time comes, don't let the sorrow bury you. Keep the fire burning. Keep living. Promise me. She bent her head to his chest, sobbing softly. I promise, she whispered. That night, he slept peacefully for the first time in days. She stayed awake beside him, her hand resting over his heart, feeling each slow beat like a fragile thread tying him to the world. At dawn, the light crept softly through the window. The storm had passed. The world outside glistened, pure and silent. She turned to him, brushing his hair back gently, and knew. His chest was still, his face peaceful, as if he had simply drifted into some deeper sleep. For a long time, she couldn't move. The fire crackled faintly, the morning light growing brighter, and still she sat there, her fingers entwined with his. There was no sound but the wind whispering outside, carrying the faint echo of his laughter, his voice, his love. When she finally rose, her body felt heavy, as though the earth itself held her down. She covered him with the quilt she had sewn their first winter together, the one he loved, and sat by his side until the sun was high. Then she stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the door. The land stretched wide and endless before her, the snow gleaming like silver. It was the same land he had worked all his life, the same sky under which they had loved, fought, and dreamed. And though her heart ached with a pain that felt bottomless, she also felt his presence everywhere, in the creak of the barn, in the whisper of the wind through the pines, in the very breath of the earth. The neighbors came to help bury him near the edge of the field, under the oak tree that had shaded them through countless summers. The children returned, grown now, with families of their own, their faces solemn, their eyes wet. Together they laid him to rest, and she stood over the grave, her hands clasped, her voice steady. He gave everything he had to this land, she said quietly. And everything he was to us. When the others left, she stayed behind, her breath clouding in the cold air. The wind stirred gently through the grass, and she smiled faintly, her tears glistening like frost. You told me to keep living, she whispered. So I will. The years that followed were quiet, but not lonely. She tended the farm with her sons, teaching them the ways their father had taught her. She read to her grandchildren by the fire, telling them stories of a man who had built his life with his hands and his heart. Sometimes, in the soft hush of evening, she would walk to the oak tree and sit by the grave, speaking to him as if he were beside her still. And in a way, he was. Every corner of the cabin held a memory, the worn chair where he used to sit and carve wood, the window where they had watched the storms roll across the plains, the porch where they had stood side by side in silence, watching their children grow. As she grew older, her hair turned silver, her hands thin and lined. But her spirit remained strong, steady as the land itself. On her last winter, when the air was sharp and the nights long, she felt her strength fading. Yet there was no fear in her heart, only calm. She lit the fire one evening, the room glowing softly, and sat in his chair, wrapping herself in the quilt they had shared. The wind outside murmured low, like an old friend. She closed her eyes and smiled. I kept my promise, she whispered into the quiet. I kept the fire burning. And as the night deepened, she felt warmth surround her, a familiar presence, a touch that had waited patiently beyond time. She felt his hand slip into hers, strong and steady once more, and when she opened her eyes, the years melted away. They stood together again, young, whole, radiant, beneath the same oak tree where he had been laid to rest. The fields stretched out golden before them, the air filled with sunlight and the scent of summer. He looked at her with that same soft smile, the one that had once shocked her with its kindness, and reached for her hand. Are you ready? He asked. She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes, not of sorrow now, but joy. I've been ready for a long time." Together, they walked into the horizon, their footsteps light, their laughter carried by the wind. The world around them shimmered with life. The farm, the cabin, the generations that would follow. And though their bodies rested beneath the earth, their love lingered, eternal as the land itself. In the whisper of the wheat, in the glow of every fire, in the heartbeat of every life their love had touched. And when the seasons turned once more, and spring brought new blooms to the fields, a pair of doves built their nest in the oak above the grave, a quiet symbol of a love that had endured every winter, every storm, and had, in the end, outlived time itself. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.